Kratom debate, 7-hydroxy-OH, 7-hydroxy-mitragynine debate, 7-OH debate, mitragynine. Today, I'm going to put all of your mysterious questions to rest once and for all and show you there's no debate, no mysteries, no questions. It's clear as daylight. And what you have out there is propaganda, marketing, and magical thinking. I'm Dr. B, Dr. B360. Several years ago, I made probably one of the first Kratom videos, and there's 2 or 3 of them in the link below that seem to have helped a lot of people. And this discussion is long overdue, and I've been asked about it many, many times. Nicole's been urging me to make this video. So let's get started. Let's get started with a brief recap of old stuff. If you really want to know this stuff, those videos still hold true in the link below. But just a brief introduction, it's stuff is Kratom is a plant. It's indigenous to Southeast Asia. Its technical name is Mitragynina speciosa. Thailand, Malaysia. It's traditionally used by natives for a long time, laborers, farmers, to fight fatigue, boost energy. It has a stimulant effect at a particular dose, which I'll clarify soon, for endurance. And also, it's been traditionally used in different cultures, tribes, indigenous regions for traditional medicinal reasons, pain, diarrhea, coughs, which is what opiates do. And yes, it is used to manage opium withdrawals. Okay. This doesn't make it okay to use in our environment for opium withdrawals. Okay. And the way that the natives usually use it, they will chew fresh leaves, they will crush it into teas, and take it that way, and even into paste and swallow it. Okay. Just a little brief background. I want to start off before we discuss to really understand 7-OH hydro 7-OH mitragynine versus mitragynine, which is the way you think of kratom in general traditionally. I want to make sure you understand what those things are in a structured scientific thinking kind of a way. Okay, when you have a plant or something like that, and that plant has something that affects either the mind or the body, there's a class of compounds called alkaloids, and they're nitrogen based. None of that matters, but know that technically there's a class of compounds that are called alkaloids. Okay, and these plants that have either psychoactive effect or effect on the body, in our case, we're interested in plants with components that have psychoactive effects. Those are alkaloids. They always have a nitrogen. And in the kratom plant, okay, they've always thought of that alkaloid as mitragynine, right? As it turns out, there's also what's called 7-hydroxy, which is on the 7th carbon. It has an alcohol group. That is another alkaloid in that plant. And what's important is when you look at these things, I put a couple of other examples for you here. In the opium poppy, morphine is one of the alkaloids. There's other alkaloids, some of them thebaine and so forth. And when you have multiple alkaloids, they get discovered at different times. But each alkaloid will have potentially, I'm giving you a spectrum. When you go to the kratom plant, 2 major alkaloids that are psychoactive are mitragynine and 7-hydroxy mitragynine, which everyone calls 7-OH. When you look at something like that, there's other questions. How much of each alkaloid is there in the plant? If you took a leaf, how much of that, the composition of that, is routinely and consistently in that plant? Next question you want to ask about each alkaloid in the plant, if there's more than one, and there usually is. If you look at opium, that's the way it is. And there's many examples. I'm just making this very simple. The other question is how much of that alkaloid is there? And each alkaloid may have different degrees of potency at the receptor of concern. Okay. And so in the mitragynine kratom leaf, it has two alkaloids that are psychoactive. There may be more. It's irrelevant right now, and that we know of. And one of them is mitragynine, and the other one is 7-OH. And each one has a certain amount in a particular piece of leaf. So you would say, most of the alkaloid is going to be, and here's a truth, in this case, with the kratom plant, it's mainly mitragynine. And I think less than 0.6% of it is 7-OH. And I have a slide that I made that shows that. But before that, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about alkaloids here. You can think of it as nature's brain active chemicals. And it's not just the brain, it's the body, but that's what we're interested in is psychoactive alkaloids, okay? Alkaloids are plant chemicals that change the brain or body, okay? And some examples that you already actually know of is caffeine, nicotine, morphine, cocaine, and the kratom alkaloids. And these are 7-OH and mitragynine, right? I think that's what people call it out there, 7-OH, but it's 7-hydroxymitragynine. And they have different effects. Okay, so when you take the plant, there will be different amounts of each alkaloid in there because there's usually more than one, and each one, regardless of how much of that alkaloid is in the plant, each one per ounce, per microgram, per milligram, however you're measuring it, may have different potency. So again, let's go to kratom. Okay, the kratom plant, you take a piece of leaf, there's a certain amount of mitragynine in there, and as it turns out, there's a certain amount of 7-OH mitragynine in there. There's different amounts and there's different potencies. Not always, but let's just focus on the kratom plant. I put this here because when it tells you a lot. So, I made this, and mitragynine, which is the main ingredient in the plant leaf, it's actually 60 to 70% of the alkaloid makeup in the kratom leaf. Okay, and when you take the mitragynine, whether it's processed or not, as it turns out, at higher doses, 15 milligrams or higher, it starts to be a mu opiate agonist, right? And it's that's where you get the opiate like properties. And at lower doses, right, it turns out to be have stimulant effects. Okay, so that's one thing. When you just take mitragynine, or when you're taking the plant, you take plenty of it. It's gonna, at the higher doses, it's gonna affect the mu opiate receptors, and it's actually relatively weak. You can take. That's why people generally would have to take large amounts in grams, even with the processed stuff you buy in the West. And yes, it's processed. Okay, and at the low doses, if you're using the plant, it's going to have stimulant properties, um, uh, uh, and stimulant-like effects, and we won't get into the pharmacology of that, but we'll leave it at that. And as it turns out, like I said, mitragynine, which is the traditional kind of thought of when you take the plant, or even the stuff that used to be in the West, that's 60 to 70% of the alkaloid in kratom. Okay, what happens actually to get that mu opiate receptor activity is that uh, mitragynine gets processed by the liver and is converted into the 7-OH form. Okay, so naturally your body takes mitragynine, processes it in the liver, and you get that 7-OH. In addition, the traditional plant, which is 60 to 70% mitragynine, which when you that gets processed in your body turns after the liver run through into 7-OH. There's also the very, very small amount of 7-OH in the plant itself. Okay. Uh, what we know now or think now is that that opiate-like effect, even if you were taking the mitragynine, is because after it gets processed in the liver and turns into 7-OH, that's how even the traditional opiate-like effect, pain, analgesic effect was happening. It's driven by mitragynine being processed. If you took just the mitragynine molecule versus the 7-OH mitragynine molecule, you would see that mitragynine by itself is actually a partial mu opiate agonist, and it's relatively weak. But 7-OH, if you took and you took the equal amounts, this stuff is much shorter acting and much stronger activity at the opiate receptor. Okay, and that chart actually shows you. You don't need to understand, the details of it, but what it shows you is the potency. Where the 7-OH compound has potency. As it turns out, it's somewhere between 10 to 20 times stronger than morphine in its potency. As far as this chart goes, just understand that, at the receptor level, what you're seeing is a potency that is way, way, way up there, close to morphine. And I say up there, but the way this chart works, it's backwards. Don't worry about it. What's important for you is to compare mitragynine, right, with 7-OH and morphine in terms of opiate receptor potency. And this slide actually kind of uh, uh, brings that out. If you took mitragynine by itself, right, when it's taken, it's much less potent than morphine, right? And it gets its analgesic activity after it's processed by the liver, and there's small amounts of it that turn into 7-OH. Okay, now if you just took plain old 7-OH, it's I would say some studies have speculated up to 20 times more potent than morphine. Keep in mind, this stuff is being sold at a gas station, right? Let's see what else is important on here. For what it's worth, the mitragynine is actually a partial agonist at the mu receptor, whereas the 7-OH mitragynine is a strong partial agonist at the mu receptor. And some of this I'm going to use for a class of graduate students, so it's not important here. But what's important is that when you take the kratom leaf, 60 to 70% of the alkaloids are actually mitragynine, and there's just trace amounts of 7-OH. And 7-OH, interestingly, if you took enough of that, there is no place where it has amount that it has stimulant activity. So the stimulant activity is not even coming from 7-OH. if you had it by itself. But what's happening in the body before you were getting this sort of pure sort of 7-OH, which we'll get into, you take the kratom with the mitragynine with this stuff, and whatever amount is there after it gets processed in the liver, you get 7-OH byproduct, and that's where the analgesic or opiate effect comes, and it's in very small amounts. By itself, it only has opiate activity as far as we know, whereas the mitragynine, also at low doses by itself, can have stimulant activity. And by the way, this is why the patients I had from years ago, and when I see people out there, they have to take large doses, 15, 20, 30 grams, because you were trying to get this thing to kick up its activity, right? And as I said, it's got minimal stimulant effect. This has noticeable at low doses. And this is a short half life. Keep in mind, anything that has a short half life has theoretically a much higher abuse and addiction potential. And that is important to know in all substance of abuse. So we can look at this, 7-OH, which is metabolized after the mitragynine is processed by the liver, is the thing that's generally responsible for the opiate-like effects, uh, analgesic effects, whatever you want to call it, in the body, and not the mitragynine itself. Mitragynine, when you are taking the mitragynine, uh, it's milder, obviously, it's longer acting in general, and it has the stimulant effect at the lower doses. And it's that conversion by the liver into 7-OH mitragynine that is the driving factor for the mu opiate receptor activity in terms of anything that is clinically apparent. Okay. All right. So that's that part of it. And what you have nowadays is, the 7-OH product. Okay. And keep in mind, this stuff is, I just told you, it's potency at the receptor somewhere between 10 to 20 times possibly stronger than morphine. And you have this stuff being sold looking like this. Head shops, I think it's at gas stations now, gummy bears. And look at these colors. They're very appealing and almost like candy. Let's just note that, okay? Um, um, this whole discussion about natural versus not natural, what's going on here, okay? Uh, I'm starting to see actually, let's come back to this. Okay, let's take a quick look at this. We'll come back to it. Um, these discussions about natural versus not natural, industrialized, commercial, whatever, in general, it's all sort of misunderstood nonsense. But let's take a starting point here. Let's just look at the 7-OH, okay? In its truly natural form, not in a way that kratom in general has been marketed over the last several years. It's found in the kratom leaf, okay, and it's trace amounts, very trace amount. And if you even realized, and I'm not talking about mitragynine being converted to 7-OH, I'm talking about 7-OH by itself in the kratom plant, it's less than 0.5 to 1 or 2%, okay? You can't extract that amount and be able to use it for large scale mass production, right? That supply is not enough to make millions and hundreds of millions of dollars off of. So what happens is there's a commercial process of extraction, right? And what you do is, if you have a certain amount of mitragynine, you are able to chemically, in an industrial setting, do a chemical reaction that turns that into 7-OH. You're not getting any more 7-OH out of the amount of mitragynine that you have. You're just able to rapidly, and using chemical science, to convert that supply into 7-OH. And here it says it is now a semi-synthetic product. That's not really true, right? I put that up there just to remind myself. You know, a semi-synthetic product is something like heroin, which is diacetyl morphine. You are changing the chemistry of the chemical found in nature. There is no heroin in nature. You're taking morphine and converting it to heroin, which is not a natural event, but it takes, well, it's called semi-synthetic because you're still using that base morphine molecule and making some changes, so it's semi-synthetic. Okay, but with 7-OH, that's not really what I would call this. All you're doing is you've created a method to rapidly turn mitragynine into a product that it naturally turns into anyway, but now you are doing it so a lot more of that product that you have turns into that. Okay, so 7-OH is natural, and commercial 7-OH comes from chemically converting a lot more of mitragynine into 7-OH mitragynine, and that's not semi-synthetic. And I put this here because to a group of other students, I want to teach that, point that out. But it's important here as this debate continues and almost changes by the day as the industry needs that discussion and public perception to change to be able to push this stuff. So if you're going to call the original stuff mitragynine natural, you're going to have to call 7-OH natural. But neither one is really, in some senses, natural anyway, because they're going through chemical processing, industrial processing. But for those that are arguing these things, and you'll see what I mean here. Essentially, what you're doing is increasing the amount of 7-OH that you get out of that batch of mitragynine that you have. Okay. Um, see what we got here. And I'm going to make a comparison here, right? When you take the traditional plant, okay, that's natural. It has a whole bunch of other plant material in it, okay? And, we probably don't know what all of those materials are. And when you take it, there's trace amounts of, 7-OH in there. And the mitragynine that's in there naturally in your body through the liver converts to 7-OH, and that's going to be a small amount. And that is what the indigenous folks and natives would use. That's natural taking of a plant. And it might be the cocoa plant, it might be gat, which I didn't put up here, and it might be opium, whatever those psychotropic effects of the natural alkaloids are. So commercially, you have two choices, right? The early traditional thing that was being put out there is, you take the kratom leaves, and what you do chemically is a process that converts or really increases the concentration uh, per uh, amount that you have of the natural kratom or natural mitragynine alkaloid, right? So it's concentrating it, right? And so, you know, you don't have to take in 10 pounds of leaves. There's a chemical process, concentrates it and then puts it in a pill, powder, whatever they did with it. And that's put out to the public. You still need quite a bit, but it's much more concentrated. But that is a chemical process that gives you concentration. With the 7-OH, it's also a chemical process, okay? And again, these are just actually where it says not purely natural, that's not true because it's about as natural as the early commercial extracts or the way it was sold previously. It's just a little bit of a different chemical process. It's not trying to concentrate the mitragynine so you don't have to take in a whole bunch of batches. It's actually focusing on the small concentration of 7-OH that's in there. Okay, maybe it isolates that, which is no big deal, but it takes a lot of that mitragynine and converts it to uh, 7-OH. That's not semi-synthetic. It's just a chemical reaction that you get more yield out of the product of conversion, which actually happens naturally. If that conversion wasn't happening in nature of turning mitragynine into 7-OH, then it would be semi synthetic like heroin because it's adding an OH group at the 7 carbon. And I would call that semi synthetic because that doesn't exist in nature in the same way that heroin doesn't exist in nature. You take the morphine, which does exist in nature, you add two acetyl groups, now it's diacetyl morphine, and that is semi synthetic. You have something that's natural, the morphine, and then you add some molecules to it, and it makes it a heroin. Okay, but that's not what's going on here. Okay, it's just two different chemical processes between uh, what was being sold before as kratom, and that chemical process was concentrating the kratom so you don't have to take down a tree in your stomach to get the effects. And this chemical process converts one product to another that was already happening in nature, in your liver, but in small trace amounts. This is important, I believe, because these discussions now have turned into, well, 7-OH is natural, the other kratom stuff is natural. So, it's not 7-OH is, the, the, the the kratom industry or 7-OH industry cheated us. No, it's all the same. You can't change your language how you like, and description of things already set in the real world in science and call it different things. My position on this whole issue has not changed, but there is something here that it shows. It shows why when people say things like, "Oh, you're a slave of the pharmaceutical industry to make money." I don't make money from the pharmaceutical industry. If I worked for these guys, I'd make a lot of money, but they're all after the same thing: huge profits, and they will say anything, and they will take something that is already a problem, the regular kratom you're buying from the head shop, and turn it into something that is that much more powerful than morphine and addicting and abuse potential, and sell it at a head shop. I'll go with the pharmaceutical industry. Um, and again, the history of the use of this alkaloid, is basically traditionally used leaves and whatever effect that has. Again, lower doses, it has a stimulant effect, which we won't get into. Higher doses, you get that conversion of 7-OH, which gives you that analgesic or opiate effect, and it would be mixed in tea, crushed, or whatever. Whereas the modern 7-OH stuff, again, it's not semi synthetic. It is no less or more natural than the processing of traditional kratom, uh, um, except it's a different processing. But you still are not creating a new molecule, which would be fully synthetic because it looks completely different than the original product. Whereas if you're adding something to the original product, it would be called semi synthetic. Okay. And again, the chemical processing here, you got the raw leaf versus the processed product, right? You know, you got in the raw leaf, you got the mitragynine product present in large amounts, and when it gets ingested, you know, there's an absolute weight to the mitragynine in a leaf, and that is what you get, and it gets processed uh, in your body and gets turned into 7-OH with a certain degree of psychotropic effect. And in that same leaf, you have trace amounts of the 7-OH already, and it's a very tiny amount. Okay. And with the mitragynine, you also get a little bit more because the byproduct of liver processing yields some 7-OH. That is where you get the analgesic opiate effect, and you need large amounts, right? With modern chemistry and industrial processing, there's a process, whether you're talking about mitragynine or 7-OH, and that process is, it removes the bulk of the other plant matter and gives you a higher density of the mitragynine. It gives you a higher concentration than the mitragynine for the amount of plant product, if you will, that you have. But the actual amount of the active mitragynine product doesn't change. What you do is concentrate it, and so it's easier to take a higher dose, but it's still chemical processing. With the 7-hydroxy, what you have again, as I explained here, when you're just taking the regular plant, there's a trace amount, and then there's whatever is converted in your body in the liver to 7-OH, which gives you the opiate-like effect, but it's still not much. And what they did after this original uh, extraction procedure is process and use the chemical process to convert a large amount of that into 7-OH product, and now what you have is a lot more 7-OH in the product that you had up here, just pure 7-OH. I'm hoping this makes sense. Now you can take a small amount. It's really simply like in terms of potency, it's comparing fentanyl to heroin, right? Fentanyl is a lot more potent, which means you just need a lot less. Uh, the analogy is good in explaining that part of it. So you get a stronger effect and you don't, in that same pill, because there's a lot more 7-OH already ready to go, and it's not going to get converted by the liver to 7-OH. It already is 7-OH, so it does what it does at the central nervous system level. Just a little bit of chemistry to ground you here. There's no, intention of confusing this. This is morphine and this is diacetylmorphine, which is heroin, right? It's still morphine. In nature, you don't find this product, right? This is chemically added to here to a product that is found in nature, and it's called semi-synthetic, right? Because half of it comes from nature, and the other parts of it that are not found in nature are purely a product of industrial chemical ingenuity and engineering. Okay. Now, if you had something like methadone, that product is nowhere to be found in nature. It may look similar to this in some ways, but it's not in nature, so it's fully synthetic. This is semi synthetic, okay? But if you look at this mitragynine thing, mitragynine is already in nature, right? And so is 7 hydroxy mitragynine, okay? It's critical to really understand that. And it's the OH group is right here on what will be called, I guess, the 7 carbon. And since these are both found in nature, you don't get to call this, now that you don't like the outcomes of the 7 hydroxy, I don't know, addiction outcomes in society, and say, well, this is not mitragynine or kratom. No, this is kratom, and this is also found in nature. Before, what we used to do is, you give me a pound of kratom leaves, and what I would do is do chemical processes with this kratom leaf to increase the density per gram, milligram, microgram, whatever, and so I could get it packed all into a pill. Then and eventually this would be converted to this in your body anyway. And there's also some of this already in that pill. Well, then I found a new chemical process where I get huge yields of this from chemical processing, and neither one of those things make one or the other less part of the kratom plant or more natural or less natural. It is what it is. It's industrial processing, which, in general, I wouldn't call that a natural product, right? That's marketing language, not clinical scientific language. Okay. Uh, we've already covered this, and this might be a little bit um, educational. Again, the traditional stuff, you take the plant with whatever is in it, which I would argue actually. I was just talking to a friend this morning. There's a certain degree of, look, things that are natural, like truly natural, right? That means I get it out of the earth, right? I take my lettuce, that comes from the earth. Yeah, there are sprays on it, but let's say if I'm growing it, it's coming out of the earth. That's natural, okay? This here is natural. And I suspect truly the human body, no matter what you're dealing with, the traditional natural, real stuff is going to be better for you, if I could use that term, than anything that is processed in a plant. But those early kratom products, they were processed. They were solvent-based concentrates, and it's not still plant only. That's nonsense. Again, I put these up there across all of these because I want to point that out over and over again. Uh, it's not plant only. Okay, this is nonsense. There is a processing going on, and it increases the concentration per amount of stuff that you have, so it's easier to pack uh, in a bottle, or get more product out there that's not bulky. Whereas this is a different processing that purifies or gives you more yield than what was happening naturally anyway. So that doesn't make it any more uh, unnatural. This is important discussion because out there now, I think one of the points they're trying to make is, oh, 7OH is not the real deal. They scammed us in the U.S. Come on, right? Um, and what they did, figured out how to really get a higher yield of the thing that was, you know had a large abuse potential, addiction potential, and so forth. Okay. Here's some examples, just so you understand. Opium poppy, right? It gets processed into morphine, right? And morphine is an uh, natural derivative of opium poppy seed, right? It is a natural alkaloid in there, but it has to go through industrial processing to extract it. And then to take that next step, you get heroin, which is, now you can say, maybe that's natural or not natural, but none of this really matters, right? I'm just trying to get you to see the differences and create a sort of a conceptual framework to understand. Uh, Kratom, raw leaf, okay, that's like opium poppy. The earlier commercial products were also a processing event, except they increased the concentration or the density in the amount you're holding in your hand. So you don't have to have a whole branch or a tree in your hand. And, and it had the mitragynine, which eventually turns it had the mitragynine and a little bit of 708, less than 0.6% or whatever it is, 0.06%, and then you had the mitragynine being converted in your liver into 7OH at small amounts. They just figured out a different processing method that gives you much higher yield of the 7OH. That doesn't make 7OH semi-synthetic in my mind, and make it so you can say, well, kratom is still good, 7OH, they lied to us, uh, um, and it's actually not a natural product, so kratom is okay to use. So I'm talking about multiple issues going out there in public right now, and I hope people are catching on to that. And That said, what I want you to take away is, let me get this off here. What I want you to take away from this is my position on kratom, the plant in its industrialized form, whether you're getting 7OH, much more pure product of the 7OH, or whether you're using the older products that were out there commercially, kratom, mitragynine. My position is the same, and please go watch the old videos. Nothing has changed. Really, what we're seeing is a validation of everything I've been saying. Uh, I've never ever said that the alkaloids in these plants cannot be utilized in a beneficial way. Ever, ever. What I've said is you should not leave it to commercial processing and commercial propaganda to sell this stuff out there at head shops and gas stations, because there is harmful side effects and abuse potential and addiction potential. Am I wrong? Well, that same industry took it, purified and created higher yield of the 7-OH, and this stuff is having an impact. If you're going to tell me 7-OH isn't the problem, Coleman Institute on the East Coast, and for full disclosure, I've partnered with them off and on over the years for their detox procedure. And I only say that just so no one ever turns and says, oh, I'm in the pocket of some industry. So, for your information, when you are, you should disclose it to the public. But I was talking to Jennifer from the Coleman Institute a couple of months ago, and she said for that month, and I don't remember when it was, 3 or 4 months ago, I think it was March, they had more people come in for 7-OH detoxes than fentanyl for the first time ever. And I myself have been treating kratom addiction for years, right? Like I said, go back to my old videos. So the takeaway from this is call it what you want: food, natural, healthy product, something that's not in the control of the FDA and pharmaceutical industry. My position has always been, as a society driven by profit, for profit, the last place this stuff should be pushed is in commercial markets. I don't deny that there's beneficial uses of the extracts of alkaloids of this stuff, but I think it should be thoroughly studied and regulated. Two, if you're someone out there that use this product, whether it's the usual kratom or the 7-OH, if you've ever used it successfully and in a beneficial way, that's a meaningless argument to me, right? I'm sure there are people that have used it in that way and argue for its being not regulated. But that is not how data translates into regulation, right? Because, there's so many people that are utilizing this stuff the wrong way, and under commercial licensing, food products, so forth, you start to get just nonsense propaganda out there to push as much as you can. And this is where government and regulation and big pharma comes in for all their limitations and fault and shortcomings. uh, we have the potential of having better management and outcomes in the long run. Leave what your thoughts in the comments. I hope this was helpful. Give a like, subscribe, and I will see you guys all soon. Peace.